On the 4th of March, 2026, South Africa lost one of the survivors of a generation that had done something genuinely extraordinary. They had looked at the most powerful, most brutal, most entrenched system of racial oppression in the 20th century, and they had refused to accept it. They went to prison for this refusal. Some of them went more than once, and when they came out, they built the country that replaced it. Mosiwa Gerard Patrick Lekota was 77 years old when he died from a prolonged illness in a Johannesburg hospital. He had stepped back from active politics the previous August to focus on his health. He had been the president of the Congress of the People, COPE, the party that he had co-founded in 2008 after breaking from the African National Congress, ANC. He had been before that the ANC's national chairperson for a decade, a cabinet member for nearly as long, and before all of that, a prisoner on Robben Island who had been welcomed there in a handwritten note on double-sided foolscap page by Nelson Mandela. His name was Terror. Welcome back to On the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Rihanna. The name Terror was not given to him by an enemy or a state that feared him, though they did fear him. Given to him by the people who watched him play football. Lekota was a striker of exceptional menace. He was described as a terror for defenders, the kind of player whose boot arriving at a ball was an event that goalkeepers dreaded. The nickname stuck. It followed him from the playing fields of Kroonstad through the student politics of Turfloop, through Robben Island and the Dalmas treason trial and the corridors of government powers, to the opposition benches of parliament in his final years. Terror in South African politics. Names carry weight. And for a man whose entire life was a sustained act of defiance against a system that wanted to make Black people small and invisible and afraid. This is a particular rightness to a name that means exactly the opposite of that. Lekota was born on the 13th of August 1940 in Kroonstad in the Orange Free State, now the Free State province. He was the eldest of 7 children in a working-class family. His primary education began at Emma Farm School, and then he attended Mariazell High School in Matatile before making a move that in retrospect has a certain historical inevitability to it. He completed his secondary education at St. Francis College, back again, a school that had, by the time Terror arrived, already sent into the world 2 of the most consequential figures of the 20th century in Africa, Robert Mugabe and Steve Biko. There is something about certain institutions, and we've seen that. Environments, the teachers, encounters with ideas, community of young people finding their convictions together. It produces clusters of people who go on to change things. And since Francis College was one of these institutions, Biko had walked its corridors. Lekota walked in after him. By the time he matriculated in 1969, he was, as he put it, well aware of the injustices that characterize Black South African life. He then enrolled at the University of the North, Turfloop. Many of these activists found their home to study social sciences, and almost immediately he found the movement that would define the next decade of his life, SASO. It was already established at Turfloop when Lekota arrived. Steve Biko had founded it in 1969. Black consciousness movement was not yet 3 years old, but it was already electrifying Black university campuses across the country. Lekota joined SASO without hesitation. He took his place on the Student Representative Council. He became one of the most visible BCM advocates at Turfloop, and inevitably, as we have seen. In 1972, he was expelled from the University of the North for his activism. It was becoming, in these years, almost a rite of passage, as I said. Tiana had been expelled from Fort Hare, Nengwekulu from Turfloop the year before, Lekota himself now from Turfloop. The state's universities were attempting to decapitate the movement by removing its student leaders from campuses. What they were actually doing was producing a generation of full-time activists who had nothing to lose. Off campus, Lekota's involvement with SASO continued and deepened. In 1974, he succeeded Abraham Tiro, who had fled into exile to Botswana as SASO's permanent organizer. It was a pivotal role in a pivotal year. 1974, Mozambique was on the verge of independence from Portuguese colonial rule. SASO wanted to celebrate. They organized the pro-Frelimo rallies in Natal. Government banned it. SASO went ahead with it anyway. Then, as we've spoken about, in September 1974, Patrick Lekota with South Scooper, Srini Mudli, and all the other accused were arrested and charged under the Terrorism Act. He was due to be married that year. The woman he was going to marry was Cynthia, daughter of the Zulu writer O.L. Sibusiso Shange. Rather than postpone the wedding, Lekota and Cynthia were married at Pretoria Central Prison on the 17th of April 1970. The SASO 9 trial ran from December to Jan of 75. All 9 defendants were convicted under the Terrorism Act. The sentences range from 5 to 6 years at Robben Island. Lekota received a sentence that would keep him on the island until 1982. And as with the universities where they created these segregated environments to educate a compliant professional class, and it backfired and created this fire of activism. Robben Island did exactly the same, where they wanted to detain and keep people away from the general populace. When people came to the island, it really turned into this political hotbed where politically conscious people would get together and have time to have conversations and read and debate. And what it did was it produced an extraordinary education for everybody that went to the island. When Lekota arrived on Robben Island, Mandela had already heard of him. In his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, Mandela wrote that he had heard reports of the bravery of Patrick Terror Lekota, a leader of the South African Students' Organization, and had sent him a note of welcome. That note, a handwritten overview of the ANC on a double-sided, foolscap page, written and signed by Mandela, was Lekota's introduction to the organization that he had not previously been a member of. The written correspondence between Lekota, Mandela, and Walter Sisulu that followed through the prison walls was, as Lekota described it later, a bridge between the black consciousness world he had come from and the ANC's broader, older, non-racial tradition. We've spoken about that this wasn't without friction. And when Lekota started moving towards the ANC's non-racial position, the BCM inmates on Robben Island were furious. The political differences were real and deeply felt. Lekota was physically attacked by some of his BCM fellow prisoners for his evolving views, an assault serious enough that the prison authorities moved him into isolation for his own protection. The next 2 years he spent in a section of the prison with Mandela, Sisulu, Katrada, and other. He described it as a tremendous learning period. What was the ideological journey he was making? Black consciousness had insisted, correctly in its historical moment, that Black South Africans needed to define and lead their own liberation on their own terms without white liberals at the front of the march. The psychological and cultural self-reclamation was a necessary precondition, but it also, in some of its expressions, tended towards racial exclusivity as a permanent political position. The ANC's tradition was different. It was not built on non-racialism. The idea that a genuinely free South Africa would be one where race determined nothing, not your rights, not your opportunities, not your identity before the law. The Freedom Charter of 1955, which we've spoken about in a previous episode, which the ANC had adopted, declared that South Africa belonged to all who live in it, black and white. I also think that if you look at Biko's teachings, he says, we don't want to get rid of you. We just want to release ourselves from the chains that has been imposed on us. We want to lead things for ourselves. We want to debate items for ourselves. And we want to build the table and the base by which we can then welcome you back to the table on our terms rather than what's been the status quo, which has been on your terms. So we'll welcome you back on our terms, and then we can talk and we can debate and we can build this new South Africa, not excluding you, but with us on equal footing. So I think if you really broke it down, it's that not that divorced from each other. I just think that maybe, and this is my perception, that sometimes when you take a hard stance, you don't see the full picture when you're talking to somebody else. Lekota himself found that he was and had always been non-racial in his instinct. The BCM had served a crucial purpose. He never denied that. But the end point he was moving towards the ANC's, a genuinely free, non-racial democracy. He was recruited to the ANC on the island, largely through the work of late Steve Tshwete, and he embraced it almost immediately. He was released at the end of 1982. He had spent 8 years on the island. He was 34 years old, and he came home to a country, as we spoke about with Seth Cooper, that was building towards the most intense period of mass resistance against apartheid that South Africa had yet seen. 8 months after his release from Robben Island, on the 20th of August 1983, Patrick Lekota attended the national launch of the United Democratic Front in Mitchells Plain, Cape Town. He was elected the UDF's National Publicity Secretary. He later described co-founding the UDF as his greatest achievement in 30-plus years of ANC-aligned politics. The UDF was unlike anything that had existed in South Africa before. It was vast, decentralized, extraordinarily diverse coalition. Civic associations, trade unions, student organizations, church groups, women organizations, and sports bodies. So it's really like entrenched in the fabric of everyday life in South Africa. Hundreds of affiliated organizations brought together under one umbrella the internal mass resistance movement that the apartheid state had been trying to prevent for decades. Its role was to coordinate and amplify the growing mass action inside the country. Rent boycotts, consumer boycotts, school boycotts, strikes, marches, and do it in a way that was legally a domestic civil society body, even while everyone understood it was effectively the internal expression of the exiled ANC's politics. The apartheid government understood this too. It moved against the UDF's leadership with the full force of the security apparatus. Lekota was arrested briefly in 1984. 1985, he was arrested again, this time along with other UDF leaders, including Popo Molefe, charged with high treason, terrorism, and murder. The charges related to the Vaal Triangle Uprising of 1984, a massive wave of community protests that had erupted across the southern Transvaal after a rent increase, and that had quickly become a broader insurrection against apartheid local government. The state's argument was that the UDF leadership had incited and directed the violence. And as is pattern with this government, the Delmas treason trial, named for the town east of Pretoria where it was heard, became the longest political trial in South African history up to that point. It ran from 1985 to 1988. Defendants were not allowed bail. They sat in prison for 4.5 years while the trial ground through its proceedings. In November 1988, Lekota and Popo Molefe were found guilty and sentenced to 12 and 10 years respectively. From their prison cells, they decided to appeal. George Bezos, our guy coming back, the legendary anti-apartheid advocate, whose legal career stretched from the Rivonia trial of Mandela and his colleagues in 1964 to this moment led the appeal. He demolished the state's case. The convictions were rescinded, and on the 15th of December 1989, just weeks before Nelson Mandela would be released and the ANC would be unbanned, Lekota and his co-accused walked free. Lekota had now spent in total more than a decade of his life in apartheid prisons, twice arrested, twice tried, twice imprisoned, and twice released. The state had thrown everything at him, and he was still standing. Within months of his release, the world had changed. The ANC was unbanned in February 1990, and Nelson Mandela was walked out of prison on the 11th of February 1990. The negotiations that would produce the first democratic election in April 1994 had begun. Lekota threw himself back into the ANC's internal structures. Walter Sisulu appointed him as the ANC's convener of Southern Natal, a region in the grip of brutal political violence, where the Inkatha Freedom Party and the ANC were fighting what was effectively a civil war, with the third force of the apartheid security services stoking the flames. He was, by accounts of those who worked with him then, visibly present in areas where other leaders focused on rebuilding in safer conditions, in violent areas, on the lower south coast, in Ndwedwe, in Hammersdale, places where showing up was genuinely dangerous. In 1991, he was elected to the ANC's National Executive Committee. In 1992, to the party's Electoral Commission. The machinery of the liberation movement was beginning to become the machinery of the government in waiting. Lekota was inside it, helping build it. On the 27th of April 1994, Africa held its first fully democratic election. ANC won. Patrick Lekota was appointed the first premier of the Free State province. The post-apartheid chapter of Patrick Lekota's life was built on a sequence of serious institutional roles. Premier of the Free State from 94 to 96, first chairperson of the National Council of Provinces, to the new Upper House of Parliament. It was established to ensure that provincial voices were heard in national registration from 1997. And then from June 1999 until September 2008, the Minister of Defense in the government of Thabo Mbeki. Defense Ministry was, in many ways, the most consequential of these roles. Lekota oversaw the integration of what had been three separate armed forces: the apartheid South African Defense Force, the ANC's military wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, and the PAC's Azanian People's Liberation Army, into a single unified national defense force that answered to a democratic civilian government. This was a technically and politically difficult task that had no guaranteed outcome. He is credited with helping transform the military from an institution that had been a primary instrument of racial oppression into one that was, at least in principle, accountable to all South Africans. He also significantly expanded South Africa's peacekeeping presence across the continent, in line with the African Union's agenda. Under his watch, South African soldiers and peacekeepers were deployed across Central and West Africa, cementing the new democracy's role as a regional stabilizer. The period in the Free State as premier had already given him a taste of what post-apartheid politics would actually look like. He had raised concerns about corruption within his own provincial structures and had been recalled by Thabo Mbeki for doing so. He later described it as the biggest regret of his political life. Not that he had raised the concerns, but that he had approached it in a way that led to him being the one who was punished rather than the corruption he had identified. The ANC that Lekota had joined on Robben Island, that he had helped rebuild in the violence-torn townships of Natal, that he had served in government for a decade, that ANC was changing. By the time of the party's watershed conference at Polokwane in December 2007, the change was visible and irreversible. Jacob Zuma's faction defeated Thabo Mbeki. In September 2008, Mbeki was recalled as president of the country by the ANC's National Executive Committee, an unprecedented intervention in South Africa's constitutional arrangements. On the 23rd of September 2008, 10 ministers submitted their resignations. Lekota was one of them. He had served under Mbeki for nearly a decade. He had watched what he believed was the ANC being captured by a faction he regarded as adverse to the values of the liberation struggle: non-racialism, constitutionalism, accountability. He was not prepared to stay and be complicit. On the 8th of October 2008, he announced that those loyal to Mbeki within the ANC would be serving divorce papers, separating themselves from the party and forming something new. It was the first mass schism from the ANC since the PAC was formed in. The new party was named the Congress of the People. The name was a deliberate echo of the 1955 Congress of the People that had adopted Freedom Charter, a claim to continuity with the best traditions of the liberation movement, against what Lekota and his colleagues saw as its betrayal. Cope's launch was remarkable. I remember it so clearly. In the 2009 elections held months after the party's forming, it won 30 seats in the National Assembly and 7.5% of the national vote. For a party that was barely a year old, formed from the wreckage of an internal ANC dispute, that was an extraordinary result. But Cope did not hold it together. The leadership struggle between Lekota and co-founder Shilowa became bitter and protracted, playing out through courts and rival party structures over years. A party that had promised an alternative hemorrhaged support with each successive election. 20 seats in 2009, 3 in 2014, 2 in 2019, and nothing in 2024. So much promise to start. By the end, held no seats in parliament. Lekota remained as party president, fighting for Cope's relevance long after most observers had written it off. The courts confirmed him as the rightful leader, but relevance is harder to win in court than a legal dispute. He stepped back from active politics in August 2025 to focus on his health. He had been battling an undisclosed illness for years, and on March the 4th, 2026, during Human Rights Month, on the 30th anniversary of South African Constitution, he died in a Johannesburg hospital. The tributes that came in that day told you something about who he was. President Cyril Ramaphosa called him a freedom fighter and a servant of the people. The ANC, the party he had left, acknowledged his indelible footprint. The Democratic Alliance leader, John Steenhuisen, whose politics could not be further from Lekota's own, said something that cut to the heart of it. He could have been a poor and beneficiary of patronage. All he had to do was keep quiet. But he chose a different path, a more difficult. This is the through line of his life. A working-class boy from Kroonstad, a footballer, a student organizer, expelled from university for refusing to keep quiet, a prisoner who used his prison time to learn, grow, and refused to become bitter, a minister who was recalled for raising concerns about corruption, a party founder who left the most powerful organization in South Africa because he could not be complicit in its compromise, a man who ended his political career on the opposition benches in a party with no seats in parliament because he had decided what he believed and was unwilling to trade it for comfort. In a letter to his daughter, Masechaba, written from prison on Robben Island, Cyril Lekota explained why he was there. Above all then, my dear, I am in prison for the sake of peace for our country and the world. I am in prison so that our generation may leave to yours and later generations a country and a world that has the greatest potential for progress. He did leave a better country, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, not what any of them had hoped for, but better. And he spent the rest of his life, even after democracy, even after government, even after the party he loved had changed into something he didn't recognize, trying to hold it to the standard he had gone to prison to establish. They called him terror. He was also in the deeper sense of the word, a builder. Thank you so much for joining me. There are politicians. There are many people on this journey that I'm on that I've never heard of until I started this. Never heard of them, never seen anything about them. And then there are people who are present, you know, in your conscience, on the news, somebody you've seen, and with the apartheid government, and even what followed post him leaving the ANC and starting COPE. The perception, I guess, of Terra Lekota wasn't something that was proudly upheld. And I don't know if that's something that those who remember the time can speak to, how the vein of his existence, you know, going into doing the research on him, the much deeper and complex person, and also somebody who wanted to do good, who wouldn't compromise himself, who wanted to build a better country for future generations. And the narrative that was put out there, and even just by that name, Terror, he was nothing like that. And I'm glad got to explore and got to tell his story. Thank you so much for listening today. Please come back next week. I am no idea who I'm doing next week. Who am I doing next week? Well, we'll find out together now, won't we? So yeah, it's always very interesting exploring people and finding them out. And this has been fun for me. I hope it's been for you. Okay, see you next week. Bye.